really glad you're all here today. We've had very few living writers being the subject of our discussion. One of them is also here today, Gail. But
I'm not mute, just disguised.
Okay. What your choice. Your choice. Hi, Steve. Hi, John. This is the poem today is actually the most recent poem we've ever done. And I saw it in the New Yorker of March 29th. It came out in the New Yorker in March 29th. I actually saw it something like a month ago because I saved the issue and I forgot why, and I opened it up about a month ago and realized that I had saved it because it had a new poem by Robert Pinsky, who's a friend and a poet I admire, and I just hadn't read the poem when the magazine came out. And then I read the poem, and then I reread the poem, and then I reread it again, and I was really I was just blown away by it. And I don't know. In the attachment that I sent, the attachment that I sent also included the link to the New Yorker website, and where you can actually hear Robert Pinsky reading the poem. But I don't know if you have to have a subscription to the New Yorker in order to open that link. I'm not sure what else.
I think so. I tried to open it and I wasn't.
Yeah. So there may be a way around it. You might be able to hear him read it on YouTube or some other venue. But I can't help you unless you have someone, unless you have a friend with a New Yorker subscription, and you can get to hear Robert reading the poem. But you're stuck with me today, so I'll read it now. At Mt Auburn Cemetery. Walking among the graves for exercise. Where do you get your ideas? How do I stop them? Looking for Mike Mazur's marker, I looked down at the grass and saw Stanislav Baranchek, our solidarity poetry reading in Poznan, years later in Newton. Now he said, I'm a US liberal with a car like everybody else. When I held Bobo dying in my arms, his green eyes told me, I am not done yet. Then he was gone. When he was young, he enjoyed leaping up onto the copy machine to press a button and hear it hum to life and rustle a blank page, then another out onto its tray. Sometimes he batted the pages down to the floor. I used to call it his hobby. Here's a marble wicker bassinet marking a baby's grave to sever the good fellowship of dust, the vet's needle, first a sedative, then death. Now Willie paces the house, mouthing his elegy for Bobo. They never meow to one another, just to people or to their nursing mother when they're small. I marvel at this massive labeled American elm, spreading above a cluster of newer names. spreading above a cluster of newer names: Chang, Ohanessian, Kondakis, joining Howells, Emerson, Parkinson. And here's a 6-foot sphere of polished granite, perfect, and inscribed Walker. Should I have let him die his own cat way? Bruce Lee spends less on a stone than Schwarzenegger, the cemetery official confided. What will mark the markers when, like mourners, they bow and kneel and topple down flat to kiss the very heaps they have in trust under the splendid elm, also marked with its tag, a noble survivor. Civilization lifted my cat from the street, gave him a name and all his shots, and determined his death. Now Willie howls the loss from room to room. When people say, I'm ashamed of being German, said Arendt, I want to say, I'm ashamed of being human. Sometimes when Bobo made the machine shoot copies of nothing, I crumpled one he could chase and combat, practicing the game of being himself. My apologies. It's a tricky poem to read out loud. I practiced, but I'm not quite there yet. He's making it hard to read out loud. What are your first impressions of the poem, and then we can talk about more things.
I'm just curious, Lloyd, in how you chose to read it that way. Sometimes you were pausing at places where I wouldn't necessarily have. Had you listened to Robert's reading, and did you bounce off of that?
Well, I have listened to it a couple of times, but a while ago, and I really wanted to sort of clear my head of his reading, and I think I was just trying to be spontaneous, and finding that I made some wrong turns. I was trying to read it in the way that the syntax made the most sense to me, but he still kept tripping me up, and I think is doing that deliberately. And it's one of the things I like about the poem.
I do think he's really trying to answer that question. Where do you get your ideas? How do I stop them? And so that's why one idea floats into another, follows from another, and it's a good faith, not just rhetorical attempt to say, I'm wandering through the cemetery, right, and I see this, and it makes me think about this, and it reminds me of that, and there's my cat. And so rather than separate all those things into neat packages, the poem is trying to take us into the rhythm of being of a real meditation about death and its many occasions. But
right, let me ask whether everyone here is familiar with Mount Auburn Cemetery. Bill, you are the furthest away today. Do you know about Mount Auburn Cemetery?
I didn't. I now know what Wikipedia has to tell you about it, but that's all. So I'm probably the least well-informed person in the room in that sense.
Anyone know the history of Mount Auburn, Auburn Cemetery?
It's the first sort of place outside of churchyards. And this was really, if you look at it in a real estate way, the first version of how condos came about. Because now people were able to buy their plots and own them, and then the cemetery would take care of them in perpetuity. Whereas in a churchyard, you were a parish member and you were just buried there, and that was it.
And it's vast.
Also, can I just
Sure,
just
Polly.
hang on to add, I've done a lot of bird watching there. That's the place you go in the spring. As I understand it, it was modeled after a cemetery in Paris that was part of the landscape. It wasn't set aside as, kind of squared off, laid out in lots cemetery. And it was part of the idea was something like garden cemeteries or something like that. And it was a place to stroll, to visit, to bird watching. And it was also started at the time that the Boston, I think it's the Horticultural Society, was setting up. And that's why there's so many beautiful trees there, real specimen trees from all over the world, which is partly why it's so great for birding. And so anyway, that's the history as I understand it. Was the combination of these two ideas, the Boston Horticultural Society and the idea, I'm not sure who the originators of the cemetery idea were, but whoever those people were put it together to make it a very natural, beckoning place to visit, which it is. It's beautiful at every time of the year.
It's beautiful and it's vast. It's got to be hundreds of acres. And there are pathways and roadways and lakes and ponds. There's a tower on a hill with a 360-degree view of Greater Boston, and many famous people buried there, and many people not very famous at all. And but it is beautiful. I think, and it's a wonderful place to walk. And I think it kind of became a real attraction during the pandemic, because you felt safe walking around this beautiful place without having to get too close to other living people.
There is another great Mount Auburn Cemetery poem by Gail Mazer with a little bit of history in it. I put a link in the chat.
Oh, thank you.
I was about to speak, but thank you, Jennifer. Well, I mean, one of the things that most people don't know about the cemetery is that a large part of it was originally the farm of Robert Creeley's great-grandfather. And the Creeley family is entitled ad infinitum to be buried there. So sometimes when you walk there, you come across Creeley's grave. And one day I was walking with my friend Megan Marshall, and it had rained, and there was a folded up poem held with a little pebble on top of Creeley's grave, which unfortunately was all runny and we couldn't read it, but it was a beautiful moment. It's just a nice thing for us poets and poetry lovers to know that that's sort of at the heart of the physical place.
That hill you describe with a full view is called Harvard Hill, and you have to be a very high up person at Harvard to be granted permission to be buried there.
Right.
Yeah, right. I mean, only in Cambridge.
Right. But
it has always been a place to, I mean, for undergraduates in schools at Cambridge, it was the place to walk. Always. especially
Yeah.
in the spring where you could be quite private, I've heard.
So you can, at, I think at the moment, because of COVID, you actually, you can't get into the tower
Mm.
to walk up to the top of the tower, but presumably it will reopen, and it is a landmark, and it is kind of amazing place.
And they're now they've redone part of the little chapel a little up the hill so that you can give a party there.
Oh,
Yeah, I went to a
well,
birthday party, and I suspect it's one of the few cemeteries that has a historic commission.
It does have also, the poem refers to it. Not everybody was always allowed to be buried there. I think there were restrictions about who was allowed to be buried in Mount Auburn.
Money
I
is certainly one of them now.
right, right, but yeah, I think it was very much. I think Robert Pinsky alludes to this sudden, or at least this recent influx of non-Anglo names. Chang, Ohanessian, Kandakis. That's a more recent element of Mount Auburn Cemetery. But we are in his head, aren't we? Jennifer, I think you got it exactly right. That we're following not just his path, but his thoughts as he is taking his walk, and that I love this second line, which is so startling, and the grammar is so peculiar. Walking among the graves for exercise. Well, he's sort of obviously setting up what happens, but where do you get your ideas? How do I stop them? Who is you?
You know, I was gonna say, Lloyd, something about this. I mean, the second line is giving us the clue to the stream of conscious procedure of the poem, and the form of an unpunctuated poem goes back to Guillaume Apollinaire Alcool, the 19th, 13th century French poet, and also associated with Montmartre and Père Lachaise. After what Polly was saying, Père Lachaise, I think, is somewhat evoked in the poem. It's almost a global cemetery when you come down to Bruce Lee spends less on a stone than Schwarzenegger because of the lettering. And
Right.
Robert's always looking for a very subtle joke or whatever. But
right.
And going back to the exercise, Robert's not a spring chicken. I'm not. None of us are. I'm thinking, is he exercising to be there? There are all sorts of nuances like that. It's a wonderful poem, but the form of the stream of conscious takes me back to Apollinaire and the sort of chaos, the chaos of thinking about death, the rupture.
So that even the grammar of that second line,
yep,
where you think, well, where do you get your ideas? He's talking to himself.
Yeah.
And then he says, how do I stop them? So he's kind of admitting, or is he really talking to someone else?
That could be one of his
where do any of us?
In.
Sorry? Say again?
I was saying that could be one an echo from a question of an admirer.
Right, right. Yeah, no,
Yeah, I agree.
exactly.
That's what it is.
It also could be the way the ideas sort of come to you and you don't know where they're coming from. It's sort of like a second person almost, other than yourself. And then
Right, right. And then, of course, you know, we like to find our or at least writers like to find a way of getting ideas, but then you don't always want ideas. Sometimes you want to get away from ideas. How do I stop them? Can you find a place? Is there a place like Mount Auburn Cemetery where you can go in order not to have ideas, in order just to let your mind wander or your eyes wander or your, you know, to, oh, a great heron. um, Besides, oh, there's Emerson's grave. There's Edwin Booth. There's the memorial to Margaret Fuller. So I immediately get hooked on this poem by the second line and the turns that it makes. Looking for Mike Mazur's marker, and Michael Mazur of course was Gail's late husband and a close friend of Robert Pinsky, who did the images for Robert's translation of Dante's Inferno. Looking for Mike Mazur's marker, I looked down at the grass and saw Stanislav Baranchek, our solidarity poetry reading in Poznan years later in Newton. Now he said, I'm a US liberal with a car like everybody else. You know what? Do you know Baranchek? He is particularly famous. I mean, he's a poet who taught at Harvard, a beloved figure, and he is especially famous for one of his great accomplishments. Anyone know?
But it was Zimborska translations.
Even bigger than that.
Really?
The Shakespeare.
Shakespeare. He translated Shakespeare into Polish. And that, I think that is the sort of high point of his international reputation. So Robert, thinking about reading with him in Poland, and then re-meeting him, you know, in around Boston, and his joking about becoming an American. And then this sudden shift to what is going to become, isn't it, the center of the poem, Bobo. Liberal with a car like everybody else. When I held Bobo, dying in my arms. His green eyes told me, I am not done yet. Oh, well, what do you make of this really radical shift to this creature? We maybe there's just enough detail to know who Bobo is. What do you think about that? Just that sudden change.
We're
He's
kept
been.
guessing. Sorry,
Bill?
Go ahead.
Well, we're kept guessing for a moment, aren't we? The name Bobo is more likely to be that of a pet than a person, although I suppose it could be a nickname. But once he's climbing up on the photocopier and sending out copies of blank sheets, we realize it must be a cat or some such. But he plays a trick on us, doesn't he? In that when he says then he was gone, we assume he's died, despite the fact that a moment earlier he seemed to be clinging on desperately to life. But later it will eventuate that he hasn't died in that moment at all. That's perhaps the moment when he gives up the ghost, but the coup de grace has to be administered by Pinsky himself, and it's then a source of guilt subsequently in the poem.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it just occurs to me that his green eyes told me I am not done yet. Then he was gone. And there's a funny little rhyme or off rhyme of done and gone. And they kind of mean almost the same thing. But there's a little twist, to that. Then he was gone when he was, and then these syntactical, these little syntactical twists. Then he was gone when he was young. And we don't know that's the beginning of a new sentence or a new thought. And yet, so it is and it isn't. And the two sort of different time periods are kind of colliding, but then we realize they're two different time periods. I don't know. Do you see what I'm?
It's a garden path sentence, isn't it? In that
yes.
We construe it one way. Eventually, it will be brought to our attention that we may have wrongly construed it, and we correct ourselves. But then there are other moments when I don't think self-correction is available to us, when he holds the balance more precisely between two syntactical options, either of which could be legitimate.
Right. Yeah.
I think with to sever the good fellowship of dust is probably the most striking example of that. That could either look backwards or forwards, and ultimately, I don't think one can resolve it.
Okay. Can anyone identify the reference? We're skipping ahead a few lines, but Bill, since you mentioned it.
No, it defeated me. I sensed that it probably was an illusion, but it brought home to me my lack of erudition, I'm afraid.
I put a link in the chat. It's George Herbert Church Monument.
Right.
Unfair inside advantage, because I know that Robert loves that poem. So
as do I. And I'm not gonna read the whole poem, though it kind of looks a little bit like it's kind of set up a little bit like Robert's poem is in sort of iambic pentameter, and and it is I think it's one of Herbert's greatest poems. I share Robert Pinsky's enthusiasm for that poem, and it's a poem. Church Monuments is actually a poem about gravestones, and the line the gravestones are laughing at jet and marble put for signs to sever the good fellowship of dust. So it's the markers, as I understand that line, and maybe this is a simplification, and Jennifer, you can help me. But they're the markers that indicate or that mark the difference between the people who have died and those of us who are still alive looking at the markers. We're all made of dust. And yet there's still a difference between the literal dust that's in the graves and that the gravestones are marking, and the metaphorical dust that we're all made of. I think my own favorite line in the poem is, "Flesh is but the glass that is the hourglass. Flesh is but the glass which holds the dust that measures all our time." So we
Also shall be crumbled into dust.
which also shall be crumbled into dust. So we're all ashes to ashes, dust to dust. We're all dust. And I think and you're right, if you know Robert well enough to know his favorite poems, you know that's one of them.
I think another really interesting element of this is that the cat is not, Bobo is not dead in Robert's mind. You know, Bobo lives in the poem, and I mean, poets write about that a lot, but I think this poem really points to this materiality. You know, the blank page being batted out of the copier is just hysterically funny. And then the fact that he crumples it up and throws it for the cat. There's something there about how nothing turns into something, and about how what is completely evanescent and dead becomes, or a blank becomes something you can play with. You know, there's a wonderful switch between the sad dust of where we all go and everything ceases, and then, you know, the ones left behind are still imagining about it and having fun with it and making the cat live again.
Yeah.
I also thought it was meant to be sort of a self-deprecating comment about us as poets, because we all think of our printer machines. You know, when the poem is done and we hit print, we're very happy about that. And this cat is producing endless papers. Maybe they're as empty as our poems. Maybe it's just another toy for him too. So having the cat do what we do, I thought was also a little bit of a self-jab.
Yeah, it's very funny. I think so too.
And also that the cat actually knows how to use the copying machine, which some of us don't always.
Yeah, at that point, I also see the copy machine as a great metaphor for the poem, that the cats breed, humans breed, we make things, we make copies of ourselves that get buried in the cemetery. And so that seems to be the thing that the poem is sort of wound around, or that the joke is wound around. And especially with later on, you get the 6-foot sphere of polished granite. And so on one hand, you have a crumpled ball of paper, on the other hand, you have this giant 6-foot granite monument, and basically the same thing. And in one, it's batted by a cat, which is very funny. And the monument, the 6-foot granite monument, is just so serious. So it's the interplay, the poem goes between those two things constantly.
I keep thinking about the difference between the cat's life, the way a cat approaches things, or another creature, versus the human way of thinking about things and mulling over things. I mean, and what's better in a way, doesn't he say somewhere, I don't have the poem, I guess I didn't get it. So I don't see it, but I seem to remember when you read it, Lloyd, that there was that he's kind of questioning the difference between the way the animal approaches things, the kind of he just goes for it, he just does it. And the human is thinking and looking, and it's all the separations of things, where a cat just is batting away this paper.
Let me read. I'm sorry, go ahead. Catherine? Oh,
and
yeah.
yet his partner, Willie, has, in this poem set in a cemetery, and, in all sorts of free associations about deaths and the past. Isn't that mowling, that made up word combining meow and howl? It's the most piercing thing in the poem, isn't it? The grief of the cat.
Of the fellow creature.
Yes, exactly. And maybe the more startling because it's in the context of the playfulness of, about crumpled up paper and
right
playing.
Yeah, let me just read those first lines. When he was young, he enjoyed leaping up onto the copy machine to press a button and hear it hum to life and rustle a blank page, then another out onto its tray. Sometimes he batted the pages down to the floor. I used to call it his hobby. And yeah, I think, John, this really does take us back to what you were saying about the analogy to writers printing out nothing and batting it to the floor. And is it just a hobby?
Yeah, there is another hand to that. Lloyd, is the grief that's actually going to make the cat like us. He's going around mowling his companion's absence. And it was reminding me when Cammie was talking about the fact that Bobo is not absent from this poem, a poem called Grief in Robert's last book, At the Foundling Hospital, where he says, let me see what he says. He says, you can't say nobody ever really dies. Of course they do. Lenny died, Mike died. But the odd thing is the person still makes a shape, distinct and present in the mind as an object in the hand. The presence in the absence. It isn't comfort, it's grief. And that sort of rejoins Robert's thinking about the same theme. He had another beautiful poem called In the Coma, also a similar meditation, trying to sing, to think thoughts to bring his companion back to life, because that's where they live in our minds and then in our poems also.
Yeah.
This is Sharon. I'd like
Hi,
to.
Sharon.
Hi, I'd like to make a comment about one line that really,
Please.
Really hits me hard. It's down towards the end of the first page. Should I have let him die his own cat way? And I've been sitting with that, and there's an understanding of cat nature that he has, where of course the cat's going to jump on things. It happens to be the copier. He figured out how to make copies. He's making his own fun. And then he crumples a ball and throws it. And the idea of so many humans dead, and then questioning, should he have let the cat die his own cat way? He takes him to the vet, you know, administers the med, and the cat's gone. But for me, there's this underlying something about taking care and being responsible for that living creature. And the only dialogue that I hear in this is Willie calling out for Bobo, and then that absence, and taking care of that living creature who doesn't communicate the same way we do, but there is a nature. And the fact that he's in Mount Auburn and walking amongst everything natural, it just sticks with me, and I don't know how to pull it apart and extract it and get a deeper meaning from it. So just my thought.
Yeah, well, yeah.
I mean, relevant to this whole conversation, I think one of the strongest moments in the story about the cat is where he quotes Arendt and says, "I'm ashamed of being human." And that's right in the middle of Willie howling the loss from room to room.
Yeah.
And I think that's where he ends up as he's trying to decide whether he did a good thing or a bad thing, in having the vet help his cat die more swiftly.
Just a few lines earlier, I totally agree with you. And just a few lines earlier, and I think this is very much connected with what Sharon was just saying also, is the word civilization. And you know, what is civilization? And is civilization tagging the trees, putting the names of the trees on the tree? It's not the tree, but it's the identification of the tree. And civilization lifted my cat from the street. Well, isn't that a good thing? Or doesn't that sound like a good thing? Gave him a name. Well, that's what we do, and that's what we civilized people do. Gave him a name, and his shots. And I mean, obviously, I can't help thinking about shots in our current world situation.
Yeah, right.
And isn't giving shots, even giving shots to an animal, a sign of civilization? Civilization lifted my cat from the street, gave him a name and all his shots, and determined his death. And we can think of all other kinds of ways in which allegedly civilized societies determine the death of others, not just animals.
It's very that's an interesting thing you're saying, Lloyd, when you go back to this determination of.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Go back, Mike. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's okay. That's fine. Earlier in the poem, he was talking about, let me see, where did the needle come in and the babe, when he finds, oh, okay. So we're going back up to, I used to call it his hobby. Right. Sometimes he batted the pages down to the floor. I used to call it his hobby. Here's a marble wicker bassinet marking a baby's grave to sever the good fellowship of dust. The vet's needle first, a sedative, then a death. That, you know how how so slightly he mentions going by this infant's or this baby's gravestone. It's so accurate. It's so mimetic of what he's speaking about. That baby's there and gone, but the thing is, that baby's grave is there, and it haunts the reader. It's haunted me, but it's also boggling to think, because the baby didn't have any time to express himself or whatever, that the cat has taken on so much more personality and so much more livelihood. And I think the mere mention and then just leaving it alone of the baby's marker is a very powerful element in this poem.
It's, of course, it's a cemetery, and there are many hundreds and hundreds of graves of infants.
Yeah.
And yet that one little marble wicker bassinet is one of the most memorable in this vast cemetery. It's one of the most memorable markers. You see that little baby's bassinet, which is the gravestone, the marble gravestone for that infant, and it's unforgettable. It comes to represent all of the hundreds and hundreds of infants, children's gravestones. Sometimes they're so old you can't even read the names on them, but there is that kind of amazing marble bassinet that you can never forget.
Lloyd?
Yeah.
I'm thinking of civilization, but I focus on the word that comes directly before civilization, and that is survivor. And that relates to the tree, which is an American elm. Most of them have died, and this is a survivor. But it also, to me, echoes a Holocaust survivor.
Definitely.
And that's what the poem sort of is going to, and this is where Hannah Arendt comes in later on.
Yeah.
And it's euthanize cats and you euthanize people. And that's sort of the central thing, without Pinsky becoming too obvious about it, without hammering.
But even noble survivor, and noble is such a human adjective.
Yes.
I'm getting more and more chopped.
A lowbrow reference.
Yeah.
When the poem says he gives the cat a name. Civilization lifted my cat from the street, gave him a name. And I sort of stopped there because in Breakfast at Tiffany's, in the movie, the cat, which is very much a part of Holly's growing up, came from the street, and when she gives it a name, it means she's going to be a grown-up, take her responsibility. And that scene of going back to look for the cat is such a visual marker.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. Great reference. Yeah, it's very moving, very touching.
Lloyd, I wonder if anybody would like to comment on the word "now" in line 6.
Now, in line 6,
to me, as to what he does with time, with that single word. Years later in Newton, now.
No, in Newton, now he said, I'm a U.S. liberal. I think that's how I read it.
Yeah, I think that's one of yeah, I see. That's one of the places where the syntax really kind of pulls the rug out from under you. And I think that's an important moment in the poem, because now is not now in reference to Baranchek, because Baranchek has died. So it can't be years later in Newton now, but it looks like that's what he's saying, and that in fact it's really part of the quotation of Baranchek's quotation. Now he said, "I'm a U.S. liberal," and that ambiguity of time, that playing with time, and I think that's right. That it's that's also what Robert Pinsky is doing with the syntax. That those phrases running together really are not just playing with language, but they're playing with time, and that all of these thoughts that he's having are just are they're doing something with time. They're playing with our sense of time. They're it's a poem about life and death, and our own thoughts, our own fears, our own identification. Some of us do go to the cemetery to take a relaxing walk, and what does that mean? And it's where we get our ideas, and how we want to stop getting those ideas.
With this moment with Baranchek, I was thinking about how his sort of wry comment about now being a liberal with a car, is the determination in the solidarity event, I guess being like the tenacity seeming kind of futile or in some way resigned or failed, then moves into Bobo's tenacity in the face of death. This like futile raging against the dying of the light that still has like an existential value. It just occurred to me as a way to a way that he's presenting Bobo's kind of attitude and force of will in relation to his own human friendships and like the struggle against an oppressive political regime, and now the oppression of death that is shared with the animal realm. It is a way of feeling sympathy for another creature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Lloyd, can I throw something?
Yes, please.
There's two nows in the poem, and both
Right.
of the nows do not occur now. So when Baranchek says his now, the now is in Robert's mind, not in the world. The next
Right.
now at the end is Willie existing in grief. But again, that Willie's not there in the cemetery. The now is in his mind. And it made me think of the Jewish mystical idea that there's no heaven, but we go on existing as long as we are thought of. And when we're no longer thought of, we disappear.
Right.
So I think maybe Robert is taking the responsibility, not just for the cat's life, that, I have to be the now that contains these lives. Because when I stop remembering them, then they literally do not exist. So his now is the all-encompassing now.
Yeah. And it's one of the most moving qualities of the poem. That really, how important is what's in his mind, and the way his mind is rambling, moving in this particular place. And it's the place that he gives the title of the poem to. And I very much want to hear what you have to say about the last line. I find it the most haunting and line in the poem, and it's the line that I keep coming back to in a way trying to explain it to myself, but I haven't found I haven't quite found a way of articulating why that last line has such particular power and resonance and feeling to it. I want to say, when people say I'm ashamed of being German, said Arendt, I want to say I'm ashamed of being human. Sometimes when Bobo made the machine shoot copies of nothing, I crumpled one. When Bobo made the machine shoot copies of nothing, I crumpled one he could chase and combat, practicing the game of being himself. And what do you, Susan?
Well, I've been trying to make sense of the whole poem and was so struck by the fact that he was looking for his friend, Mike Mazer, and instead got caught up in all of these other ideas and not being able to stop them, and the ways that grief catch us by surprise. And it's the cat who it gets the deepest emotional reaction, I think, from the poet. And then in the middle of the poem, that eloquent, the cemetery, after the cemetery official confiding, the eloquence of the markers when, like mourners, they bow and kneel and topple down flat to kiss, that in a way is the most lyrical, poetical statement for me. And then the horror of civilization doing good things, but also doing these horrible things. And I was struck in the last line with, you expect him to say that the cat will bat the ball. And that, for me, using the word combat suggests a struggle that's been going on in his mind with this whole process of free association, of not being able to focus grief, but grief following its own patterns, the way the mind and emotions don't necessarily follow straight lines. And for me, the lack of punctuation and the forcing us to go backwards and forwards and takes a great deal of courage, and is very exciting on Pinsky's part because it's mimicking or creating a form in which we are doing, I think, what the poet himself is doing. So practicing the game of being himself, the game of life, anyway, I'm sorry, I held all those things.
No, but also you make me think the game of poetry, the game of, and that this is his game, that don't we all, aren't we all? It's not just the cat, but aren't all of us playing the game of being ourselves, of trying to be ourselves?
But it's not just that. It's practicing life. Life includes death. Death is an incredible part of death. And in order to live, we all have to kill in order to eat. And so that is part of when he's practicing being himself, he's living and he's killing. And that's who he is. That's who the cat is. And that's who we all are.
And who we all are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think beyond, I think there's more the creativity rather than the killing. He's shooting copies of nothing and then practicing being himself. I think it's what the poet does, what the creative people do.
Right.
You make something out of nothing. And that's sort of the central issue in this poem about how you do that and how you lose that. But it becomes the creative process.
Right.
I'm also
Right.
thinking that it's a meditation a little on our human illusion and how futile it is of how we control life and death. I mean, and we create this civilization where the tree is already there, but we put a plaque up and name the tree. The cat already is living its life, but we name it and give it shots and
rescue it.
Yes, and we create places where we put our dead and put lovely pathways and statues.
And yeah, and next to trees and birds and
Yeah, also Lloyd,
yeah,
the ending really sort of goes back to the beginning, because what Robert's getting out, he's exercising at the beginning of the poem, and the cat is practicing the game of himself at the end. But it's also, I think, practicing the game. The word combat is, I think, pretty strong word, and you have to think of the predatory nature of cats. They're that way. That's who they are, and none of us with any maturity are going to scold a cat for killing a mouse or a bird. That is their nature.
Right.
Is it everybody's? I would question that. You know, there are aggressive natures in humanity, and there are passive natures in humanity too. So, you know, the game of himself, it looks like a game. Maybe what one species does can never be taken terribly seriously by other species. I don't know.
You mean including our own?
Yeah.
I'd like
sure.
to
Sharon?
piggyback on that, and I agree. And it's also cats' behaviors, they owe no apologies. It is their nature. So when he uses the Arendt quote about, you know, hating, you know, being ashamed of being human, cats, it's their nature to do that. And for humans, there is a difference between the predatory behavior of a cat and what is seen as predatory by humans who have the choice, or this is a question, the choice to make decisions that are not predatory, that they can survive without doing evil.
Yeah, unless that's part of their nature. Some people are predators.
Yes, but for cats, they owe no one any apology.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the line that that I see in that. So
that's a good point you make, Sharon, because dogs do apologize. You know, when a dog is sorry, and he lets you know he's sorry.
Well, cats are demigods, so there's my bias.
Yep, they are. Yep.
Is the oddity of the final passage increased by the fact that it doesn't seem obviously to be an example of behavior which might make one feel ashamed of being human? It's preceded by the line from Hannah Arendt, and one can see how the fact that he has euthanized the cat makes him feel a connection with the Nazis, who, after all, preceded the Jewish Holocaust with an assault on people with cleft palates and hair lips at Schloss Hartheim or other places. So it refers back to something which legitimizes its presence, but it ushers in a moment of kindness when he enabled the cat to be itself. That seems to be a moment when one might be almost proud of being human rather than ashamed. So there's a certain strangeness about that disconnection.
Yeah.
It also goes back to the civilization thing. The cat living its own life would chase and combat something. Here, it's an artificial, it's a civilized version of what the cat would do.
But part of what the narrator is doing here is imitating a cat. Part of this poem is a howl for the lost companion whose grave he is looking for. And that winds its way through the poem.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's right.
You know what, Lloyd, I just wanted to say quickly, I just loved what Susan said. And I felt like when you were reading the poem, it was so lovely to hear the syntax made me think, because I wasn't sure where I was in the poem.
Right.
And it was like the author was inviting us to be in his head as he was thinking of all these different things and putting it between human and cats. And I thought it was really beautiful.
Great. Yeah, I actually, because it's a challenge, I actually invite you all to read this poem out loud to yourselves, and where you really, you kind of get tongue-tied, because you need to be thinking ahead and back at the same time as to where you are and what the language is doing, and how both playful it is and how real it is in terms of actually conveying the way our minds work, the way my mind works, looking forward and back and correcting myself. And I think there's something really inspired about, I mean, Robert Pinsky is such an elegant and eloquent writer, and a writer of incredibly sophisticated syntax, and almost a kind of literary syntax. And I'm not used to him doing this in a poem. His poems are usually in real sentences and real paragraphs, and are very discursive. And for him to be I think one of the things that really startled me about reading this poem for the first time was, whoa, Robert, you're doing something that I was not expecting from you.
Can I say something about this, Lloyd?
Yes.
Because I've been thinking about syntax, which is, which is usually the invisible work that sentences do, arranging our thoughts in time and in relation to each other. We say one word after another, but the thoughts are always circling back and around. And that the way a sentence orchestrates those things is essential to the workings of the poem. And the Herbert poem that Robert cites, Church Monuments, is one that maybe epitomizes some of the most marvelous work and so it's in the link. Read the poem if you get a chance. But Herbert is grappling with these same questions. What is the sweet fellowship of dust? When we all die and we all become dust, and the distinction between life and matter and material and human goes, that it's almost a joke to put up a stone and say the living are here and the dead are there. And the way that Herbert grapples with it when he's kneeling in a church is to try to marshal the forces, that the structuring forces that syntax can give him, so that, for example, the first stanza starts, while that my soul repairs to her devotion, here I entomb my flesh, that it at times may take acquaintance of this heap of dust, to which the blast of death's incessant motion, fed with the exhalation of our crimes, drives all at last. You know, a long sentence that I use up my breath to say, that is very carefully articulating the different forces, both that are going to tear us apart or that we might try to.
Okay. Yeah. You have a question? I thought Gail was asked. Sorry, Jennifer.
Anyway, that's just to say. So I think all the wonderful things that people have been saying about the games and the serious games of the way the poet might make something out of nothing, and what that has to do with civilization, or what that has to do with the way a cat might play. That sentences are tools in this as well. And although I wouldn't want to say that Robert was planning to say, what if I took up Herbert's issues and used the opposite kind of sentence? Where would that take me? And what would I discover? I'm not in a church on my knees. I'm at the cemetery for exercise. So I feel that what you feel, Lloyd, it's surprising to have Robert write this way. And it's not just surprising against his own practice, but surprising reaching back to his love of a tradition where the poem that epitomizes the work that syntax can do is this Church Monuments poem by Herbert.
Yeah. And it's just something I just so profoundly admire him for doing, and kind of the poem becomes the hourglass that's turning to dust as the dust is moving through the hourglass.
That's what you were saying about syntax is distilled in the last line, which has a surprise, I think, in the last two words, because practicing the game, the kind of game you have to practice is a human kind of game, or it has rules and you have to practice it to improve your skills at it. And that's not the cat practicing the game of being himself. I mean, the kind of game you practice in basketball and you shoot hoops in the backyard, but the cat is just being himself.
Yeah.
He's not being just being German or being human. He's being himself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's good also. The cat is also very imaginative in the fact that he can turn a crumpled piece of paper into something of prey, like a mouse or something. It's almost like writing poetry. You're recreating life, the world, a moment. And I know sometimes how sort of intense I get while I'm writing. Like the thing is there, you're there again, it's there. And that's how the cat the cat is a pretty good metaphor. We've gone over this before, but maybe not at this angle, that how the cat's playing is like writing poetry in a sense. It's an act of vivid imagination.
But you also think to the almost kind of pre-computer days when you tear a page out of the typewriter and think, oh, this is just garbage, and you crumple it up and toss it or kick it or step on it and wish it would disappear. Now it's all.
Now you can just press delete.
Yes. Now exactly. Well, this is great. I think we will do an older poem next time.
Could I ask one more thing about this one?
Oh, Bill, of course, yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether anyone else feels as I do that in a way it's a poem which shouldn't be read out loud, that it exists really in its authentic form only on the page, because on the page the ambiguities we've been identifying still exist, but one has to plump for one option or another when one reads it out. I was surprised indeed to learn that Robert Pinsky had given a reading of it, because I've come across poets. A notable one, I'm not sure how well known in America, is Jeremy Prynne, who sometimes won't read a poem out. He has a poem called either Refuse Collection or Refuse Collection, and when he reads it, he says that he is going to skip past the title because he doesn't want to resolve the ambiguity which exists on the page. And here, in reading it out, we circumscribe and narrow the poem in a sense, but apparently Pinsky doesn't mind our doing that because he himself will do it.
Well, I think the New Yorker just asks people to do that, and then
I see,
and then they just do it. I think all the poems in the New Yorker, if you go online, they're all they all include a link to readings by the poets. I think that's their mode now, and if you want to get published in the New Yorker,
you have to fall into line.
Unlike most of us. You have to do that. How do you spell the name of? How do you spell Prynne's name?
Well, Jeremy is his forename, but he publishes under J.H. Prynne, Prynne.
Prynne.
Yeah, in England he's big news, but he was a friend of. He was an early critic of Olson. His correspondence with Olson has recently been published. He was a big pal of Ed Dorn's, so he has connections with American poetry, but apparently isn't widely known. He taught at Cambridge for donkey's years, and we over here we talk about the Cambridge school gathered around him. He's the kind of chef d'école.
I don't know him at all.
I would disagree with, or put a different point of view. I think it's exactly in reading it, trying to read it out loud, that you think, I don't know. And if you read it fast enough, you just read it one way or the other. But I tried to read it a second time out loud to myself and thought I should really put punctuation in this so I can read it smoothly. And then I thought, maybe not. Maybe I'm supposed to go on the one hand, on the other. And I think it's in reading out loud that we challenge ourselves to address the complexities.
Yeah.
That's the other point of view.
Yeah. Well, I certainly found that trying to read it out loud today, that I'm thinking both oh no and oh yes at exactly the same time.
Did you feel that when you read? I remember when you read the last bit of the Frank O'Hara poem, whispered a song along the keyboard to Noel Waldron. and everyone and I stop breathing. The and everyone could be objective. It could be associated with Mal Waldron, whispered it to Mal Waldron and everyone, comma, and I stop breathing. So there's a play with subject-object indeterminacy there, and the two meanings which emerge are interestingly conflicting. So in one sense, what Pinsky does here is extend to a whole poem what Frank O'Hara does in that last line of The Day Lady Died.
Yeah, although I have to say I think I made up my mind a long time ago about which everyone it was, and that for me it's everyone and I.
No, it was clear from your reading that was the way you had resolved the matter. But
yeah. But
if you read it the other way, whispering a song to Mal Waldron and everyone. It makes perfect sense and an interesting kind of sense.
Yeah.
The both thing I think is it was a typographical invention for the non-punctuated poem, a lot like William Carlos Williams and the spaced poem, or E. Cummings, and so these were part of early modernism, and it's not that they're not to be read, because they can be read in a variety of ways, very interesting ways. And also Robert, if you go back through his canon, he's an advocate for the spoken word and spoken poetry. So it's gonna have to be a both thing on this. It's just the shift of emphasis to an early modernist reader would take this, the lack of punctuation as, wow, this is machines taking over and all of that. It's kind of exciting. Is it scary, or what's going on? So
may I ask one other thing? Practically everything I had thought about the poem has been covered by people, but no one's mentioned the stranded I at the end of the line, or to their nursing mother when they're small I. The natural way to negotiate the relationship between syntax and meter there would be to put I at the start of the next line. I just wonder why he leaves I stranded at the end of that line. I don't have any answers, but I do have the question.
Yeah. My guess is that small I is a phrase that Robert Pinsky probably wanted us to see.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
And that he was playing with that, and that
so it's a sort of self-deprecatory gesture in a way.
Kind of, yeah.
Interesting.
Or referring to the baby's grave. They're small. I marvel at this massive labeled American elm, because marvel could then be an imperative rather than a simple subject, a simple verb.
Also,
yes.
Also, American elms are pretty rare because of the blight that eliminated most.
Sorry.
Oh, how many people do we have apologizing?
Yeah, we're not cats, are we?
So one of the sort of rarities of the Mount Auburn Cemetery is that there are two gigantic American elms, both labeled, and that have both survived the blight that has destroyed so many elm trees. most elm trees in this country. I think, Marita, we need to let you go. And I think you are not at the library today, so thank you for your hospitality, and thank you for arranging this. Yes,
Thank
to
you.
Marita,
Thank
and we shall be in touch. And I hope we have we can find. In December is a tricky month. So we'll see if there is a time, if there's a Saturday in December, or maybe we just need to wish each other a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year and meet again in January. We'll decide.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Lloyd.
This was a great conversation, and I'm very glad to see everyone and welcome some of you back. Welcome some of you for the first time. Thank you very much. And thanks, Marita.
You're
Good seeing
welcome.
you, Lloyd.
And thank you, Lloyd. Take care, everyone.